Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Marissa Kozlov. It's great to have you with us for today's eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of media, ad tech, and martech. Today, we'll hear why the connection between search, sentiment, and consideration matters to marketers. So before we get to that, let's meet my guest who's joining us today from New York. We have Isaac Gerber, Global Director of Insights at Captify. Isaac, it is so nice to have you back with us on the show.
Great to be back, Marissa. Thank you.
Really excited for all that you have in store for us today. And I also want to remind our audience who's with us that Isaac is going to be sticking around for a Q&A in the second part of the show. So please keep it conversational with us. Just use that chat window that you see on the right side of your screen to tell us not only where you're joining us from, but also to submit your questions. And we will do our best to get to as many of those as possible. So please keep it coming. Okay, as promised, we have a lot of great content planned for you today. Isaac, let's get started.
Thanks, Marissa. So thrilled to be here. Today, we'll be talking about the recent report that we produce at Captify, which is the Top 100 Advertisers Search Report. This is looking through the lens of search to understand consumer sentiment towards brands. We've used that to rank the top advertisers in the US, and we're going to have some insights about how that might help you, your brand, really understand current sentiment and how you can improve it. Before that, though, we're going to talk a little bit about why this even matters, why you might even care to use search to better understand your brand, and how sentiment enters the picture. Once we've established that, we'll talk about the report itself, dive into some specific brand highlights, and then, as Marissa mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Let's dive in. So before we talk about the solution, if you will, let's talk about the problem. This is a wonderful comic from the marketunist Tom Fishburne that he came out with a few weeks ago. And it highlights the real challenge with traditional market research. A lot of brands place emphasis on their strategy and kind of acts as the bedrock using traditional market research. And at the end of the day, market research is a powerful way to understand what people say. Unfortunately, what people say isn't always what they do. They may not realize what they truly want. They may not be thinking about it in a deep way, and it's not tied to action. Not only is this a challenge with market research broadly, it's a challenge with some specific metrics that are important in the industry, such as Net Promoter Score. Net searcher sentiment, which we're going to talk about in a few moments, is something that we've introduced to solve this, but Net Promoter Score, just to lay it out, is a really popular metric that's been used by brand managers since it's been introduced about 20 years ago. Net Promoter Score ranks on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this product to friends or family? Those who rank it 9 or 10 are promoters. Those who rank it 0 to 6 are detractors. The 7 and 8 are viewed as neutral. And the Net Promoter Score takes those promoters, subtracts the detractors to give you the Net Promoter Score. Now, what's really powerful about this is it's a summary statistic. It's a single number that a brand manager can use to understand, here's how people feel about my brand. Here's how that's changing over time. Unfortunately, action is really separate from words. And what people say in that measurement, in that study, in that survey, if you will, is often quite different from how they feel at the end of the day and the actions that they're going to take. Not only that, but there's a lot of companies who have started using Net Promoter Score as an important metric to measure and reward success. And line managers might not be compensated just on the overall sales of their division, but also on the Net Promoter Score that customers have. This introduces a really challenging and perverse incentive and has led to instances where managers actively tell customers, you're about to receive a survey, give me a 10. Because it's going to affect my compensation. It's going to affect my ability to have this job. And that really deeply biases the results that you get. If you can imagine all of these line managers doing this, and now all of a sudden, all of that data is getting filtered up and viewed without the context that some of this might have been gathered in a way that has pretty deep bias. Now, if market research in the traditional way isn't the right solution, what is? So we believe that search is really the most powerful indicator of how folks feel about your brand and gives a really deep, real-time, and true sense of what people care about, how they care about, and how that's changing over time. It's really free of all that bias that we spoke of. There's no way to influence how people are searching. It's unprompted. People are searching for what they care about when they care about it because they're interested. They want to learn more about a product. They want to buy it. They want to understand it deeper. So it really ties directly to how people care about it and the intent that they have. So now that we understand a different way of viewing this kind of research, what we decided is, can we bring these concepts together? And enter net searcher sentiment, or NSS. NSS is similar to NPS in that it looks at a summary statistic, a single metric that a brand manager can use to understand the health of their brand. However, net searcher sentiment, what it does is, instead of doing a survey, we look at searches over time and classify them as positive or negative. When folks search for your brand and that search is accompanied by keywords like love, like, great, excellent, that's a positive search. When it's accompanied by keywords like hate, terrible, broken, awful, that's a negative search. Net searcher sentiment then brings those pieces together to take those positive searches, subtracting the negative searches to give you that net searcher sentiment. It has that same benefit, as I mentioned, of Net Promoter Score, in that it's a single metric that can be measured over time, but it's really free from the bias that might come from how we select who gets a survey. It's available real time. You don't need to administer a new survey because the data is already there if you're collecting it. To motivate this a little bit further, I'm going to talk through 3 specific examples behind net searcher sentiment. Once we've introduced this, I'll go through the report and we'll talk through some of these top contenders. Now, the interesting part of these 3 first brands is we're going to be looking at sentiment from a negative perspective. When we talk about the report, obviously, it's the top company, so it's going to be a very positive conversation. But really interestingly, the genesis of NSS was thinking about negative sentiment towards a brand and how can we measure it and how can we combat it. The original idea came when we were looking at Netflix. They've introduced an advertising tier to their program. When Netflix first announced this a couple of years ago, we asked ourselves, is there a way that we can really understand how the market is responding to this announcement from Netflix, this new announcement that all of a sudden there's going to be advertising within the streaming service? So we set out to what we first did was we looked at searches over time. How much are people searching for Netflix and how has that changed as a result of this announcement? Now, not surprisingly, the searches were way up. There was a lot of interest that we see rising in Netflix around the time of the announcement. Now, of course, just because someone is searching for a brand isn't directly necessarily a good thing. So we wanted to go a level deeper, and that's when we started tying in sentiment. When we brought in this concept of sentiment to understand the perception of Netflix, we quickly came to see that even though the quantity of searches were up in general, the sentiment was down, and down quite starkly. Folks were not really happy about this announcement of ads within the Netflix product. Now, it's worth noting there was one profile of folks who were positive that matched an investor type. Folks who were more likely to be investors, were in that kind of community, did view the announcement with a positive view, as it would have potential positive upside for Netflix from in the revenue and sales. But outside of that, when you looked kind of in aggregate, the consumer perception was relatively negative. Now, moving on to Boeing. Boeing and HP, which is the last example on the negative side I'm going to give today. These were both examples that were included when we first published findings around net searcher sentiment. And what we looked at for Boeing was really kind of the start of the challenges that company has had over the past few years. It seems like they really can't catch a break with negative news following negative news. This was a few years ago, so it's not like the Alaskan Airlines thing that's more recent, but rather there were a few negative things that had started to happen. There was a crash around Ethiopia, and there was also news of layoffs. What we saw was, in general, for most of this year, the year in which we were doing this, which was 2022, they had relatively neutral sentiment. However, immediately upon some of this news breaking, we saw a drop of about 20 points, which is significant for their sentiment, showing that really net searcher sentiment provides an immediate view in consumer perception. You don't need to spin up a study and do all these things in order to get your results. Within minutes, you can understand immediately what the perception is and how it has changed as a result of some of this news. Now, HP is a bit of a different story. They've had relatively positive sentiment over time, except for March. Once again, this is 2022, when we originally did this research. What we saw was they had an unfortunate bug with one of their products that had released, a laptop. This bug was causing the laptop to freeze, to essentially brick and become unusable. Now, HP was able to release a fix to this pretty much immediately. And what we saw that was very telling, was very interesting, is their sentiment rebounded immediately. They had a single week of negative sentiment, and after which they rebounded and essentially made up almost all of their lost ground. This tells us that not only is net searcher sentiment good at understanding the negative changes and how that happens over time, but can measure and understand how the reaction that is to say, how the response that a company takes can really benefit them and drive a difference. It's not enough to just acknowledge a mistake. There needs to be some kind of a fix to it, which HP did. And by doing so, and by doing so quickly, they were able to make up for that lost ground. Now that we've talked through the report, the net searcher sentiment overall, I'm excited to dive in and talk about the report. Now, it is the top 100 advertiser search report. We're not going to go through 100 different brands today. However, everyone who is joining us will get a copy of this report, and in it, you'll be able to go through, you'll be able to see the rankings of all 100 companies. And not only that, but we've done category spotlights, where we've looked at top vertical categories and provided a view into all of those brands within the categories, as well as a few more details about the top brands for each category. Excellent. Let's dive in. So in front of you right now is the top 10. These are the top 10 brands overall across all categories. In the top 3, we have Airbnb, we have Viacom, CBS, and we have Netflix. Now, Netflix is a really interesting story because this is really where we came up with the original idea behind NSS, as I mentioned, and that was coming from a negative perspective. They've since gained a lot of ground and have really shown to come out on the other side of that. So one of the other takeaways here is that it is always possible for brands to get past that negative sentiment if they view what customers are saying seriously and take appropriate action to correct it. Now, in the rest of our conversation today, we're going to dive into 3 specific brands. We're going to dive into Airbnb, which is not only the top brand overall, but they're the top brand within the category for travel. We're then going to look at the consumer tech category, where Apple is the top brand. And then finally, we're going to look at the financial services category. We're going to dive into the top brand, which is Amex. Now, Amex, as you've noticed, is not within the top 10. We're including it here because financial services overall tend to rank lower in net searcher sentiment than the other categories. And we thought that there were some interesting takeaways about how they might be able to rise a bit higher that I think would be of help to everyone here today. Excellent. So let's dive in and look at Airbnb. So as I mentioned, Airbnb, #1 in travel, #1 overall. And not only that, their score was almost 3 times higher than the #2 brand. When we're looking at the travel category, not only are they #1, they were actually the only brand to be positive for the entire year. Now, how did they do that? There's 2 key things that we saw that made Airbnb truly successful here. The first is that the brand became almost synonymous with what they were, not even the products that they were selling. The brand became associated with the experience. Folks who went to Airbnb were less looking for kind of a functional utilitarian, I want to book a place to stay. And folks were more thinking about the brand from the terms of, I'm looking for an adventure. I'm looking for an experience. When we saw these searches, people were really looking for that kind of sense of adventure. And this was being associated directly with the Airbnb brand, causing a really strong performance for that brand. What Airbnb did successfully here was really associate themselves with that benefit and focus on that over the product, and essentially get the brand almost out of the way of that experience. This was really successful and is what has allowed Airbnb to succeed within the travel category and overall. However, there was something else that was also very powerful and underpinned their success, and that was employee views. A lot of the searches that we saw with positive sentiment towards the brand were looking for employee related benefits, looking for things like what is the culture, looking for things like understanding the environment that employees have within the company. Now, of course, ensuring that the employees are happy and productive and successful is a real powerful way of ensuring that the service being delivered is excellent. If your employees are overall happy working at your organization, that's going to really ensure that service is excellent and that customers have a great experience. So what we're seeing is these consumer aspect and this employee aspect combined to create a virtuous cycle, continuing to fuel this positive sentiment towards the brand. Moving on and talking about our second case study here today, Apple. Apple is number 9 overall within this year's report and number 1 within the consumer technology category. Obviously, Apple very well known for the products that they've launched, Macs, and then even more than that, iPods, tablets, etc. However, even though they have a tremendous number of products, very similar to Airbnb, it's ultimately about the experience. Really ensuring that Apple is viewed from an emotional and positive way has always been core, if you will, to the experience that Apple is selling. If you think back to a Steve Jobs keynote or even more recent with Tim Cook, it's really not about the product, it's what the product enables. It's about using an iPhone not for the great technology that it encompasses, but rather as a device that allows you to connect with your friends, allows you to take pictures of your kids, allows you to really be there with your family in spirit if you can't be with them in person. Products are also not just good, not just great, they're insanely great. Apple has from the beginning positioned itself and its products as part of your life in a way that is emotional, not rational. And we see this as a success story in terms of the sentiment towards the brand. And finally, American Express. So American Express, as I mentioned, is number 1 within that financial services category, but number 35 overall. A lot of this is driven by the fact that, in general, the financial services category had neutral to negative sentiment. American Express did stand out, but there's really things that the category can think about overall in terms of how to position themselves. Now, when we think of American Express, we of course think about their top tier and kind of storied credit cards, the Platinum card, perhaps the Centurion card, the Gold card. These are products that have been around for a bit and have a certain level of prestige to them. That still carries a lot of weight, and we see a lot of favorable views towards their products. Now, more recently, they've expanded the portfolio to have cards and products at different prices to appeal to different levels of consumers. There's definitely positive sentiment towards this in terms of the product selection. We see a lot of sentiment that's positive in folks searching for it, really happy with the different options that they have and happy with the breadth of choices available to them. However, what we see is it's still product focus. When we think about Apple, when we think about Airbnb, it's that experience focus. It's about that benefit focus that they've been able to achieve that American Express is not, we're not seeing that association. In our opinion, this is a bit of a missed opportunity ultimately, because you think about a lot of how Amex tries to position their product, especially at the higher end. They really are trying to position their higher end cards as enabling experiences. You're going to use your Amex Platinum in order to book travel, in order to get an exclusive experience. So why have they not been as successful in that association? I think ultimately one of the biggest factors here comes down to competitive differentiation. A lot of what made Amex unique historically has eroded over time, especially with newer competitors such as Chase and their Sapphire card. They're essentially copying the same playbook that Amex has used for years, and we're seeing that differentiation disappear, and ultimately the way that people view Amex is becoming more product focused. Now, if there's a way for Amex to get past that and really move towards that benefit-focused perspective that the other brands have achieved, we think there's an opportunity to go even higher in this report. And ultimately, the other brands in this category could be thinking about that as well. Now, before we open it up to questions, I wanted to provide a final case study. Our conversation today has focused on what is NSS, how does search and sentiment help me understand my brand, and then, of course, the rankings. Now, the power behind NSS and search metrics in general is not only do they give us a view to understand what people think today, they give us a means to improve it. And I wanted to highlight one case study of a brand, in this case, a pet health brand, that we worked with to understand not just where their sentiment was today, but to come up with a campaign to improve that sentiment. They have a product aimed at pets who need help with ticks, heartworms, etc., and they wanted to improve their sentiment in market. We were able to identify audiences that had the most negative sentiment, and by showing the right message, we were able to improve awareness of the brand by 60%, which is great, but even more than that, improve their sentiment by over 400%. So ultimately, when you think about sentiment and the role that it can play within your brand plan, net search or sentiment can give you that way to understand, here's where I am, here's where my competitors are, but here's what we can do to improve it, to ultimately tell the right story that connects with our customers. Now, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Marissa to see what questions we have.
Thank you, Isaac. That was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that great information about sentiment. I mean, I know I certainly learned a ton about NSS and what that means for advertisers, but also thank you for sharing the findings with us, as well as those great case studies from the wonderful report that you and the team at Captify published. So let's get right to those Q&A. We have quite a few questions that have come in. Our first viewer says, I'm already using social listening to measure sentiment. So why would I use search data instead? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, one that we get, frankly, all the time. Sentiment historically, I think, has been viewed through that lens of social, of using social listening products. There's a few really deep challenges with that, though, to be candid. The first is that people are posting on social media for a number of reasons, but one of the big ones is they're trying to go viral. It's not reality. People are posting on social media to send a message, to make a splash, etc. It does not really necessarily reflect reality. I mean, just think of like perhaps your friends out there who are posting on Instagram, or maybe your own post. Like, is that really how you completely feel? Is that the reality of your life? So using those kinds of inputs, using that data ultimately to answer a brand question is really challenging, because that might be even more skewed than a survey-based approach. The other thing that I'd bring up in terms of social is that it's a lot of the social listening that was put in place, I think, came from a time when the social landscape was more certain. Let's say there's been so many shifts in the past couple of years with Twitter becoming X, the rise of Threads, and then obviously the rise of TikTok, where social listening tools no longer really necessarily get as much signal even as they did. So I'd say you're getting less data than you would have a year ago, and the quality of that data is quite suspect. So those are the reasons why I'd really put a lot of caution behind using social data to really understand sentiment.
Yeah, those are some great points about wanting to go viral versus actual sentiment. So thank you for bringing that up. Our next viewer had a question about cookies. You know, the deprecation of the third-party cookie has been a hot topic for a few years. How do cookies factor into this, if they do at all?
Yeah. So, wow, cookie deprecation, or cookie getting, as I like to call it. We'll see if that ever actually happens. The can keeps getting kicked down the road, but regardless, really the great news is that ultimately the measurement here, search metrics and NSS specifically, does not have any reliance on third-party cookies. It's about understanding what people are searching for, taking that in aggregate, and then looking at how that changes over time. So the great news is that it's completely separate and immune to whatever happens with those third-party cookies.
All right, well, good to know about that. You shared a lot of brand names within your slides today, brands that we've all known for many years. Are there any common themes among companies that consistently do well with NSS?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a few different stories that come out there. The first is that brands that do well. Let me say what I mean by that. we see a real strong correlation between short-term and long-term performance, that the brands that are paying attention to their sentiment and trying to work on it over time, we see that the brands that are positive tend to stay positive, almost kind of an inertia, not because they're doing nothing and it's just happening, but because of the effort that they're putting into it. So I'd say that that's the first thing that I'd see. The second thing is just going back to some of the examples that we were talking about today. It's about benefit over feature, which I know is kind of an adage in marketing in general, but sometimes it's hard to forget that. It's easy to forget that, I mean to say. And you can get lost and really focus on the product, focus on the feature, instead of really focus on what it's going to enable for your customer. So really the best brands succeed consistently in having that customer focus and focusing on that benefit and how it's going to improve their lives, and putting almost the customer as the hero, if you will, and the experience as the hero. We see that really that's quite successful in driving positive sentiment.
Got it. And you did touch on that as well, specifically when you talked about Apple and their products, not even about the technology, but thinking more about taking pictures or having the ability to make your life a little bit easier or more fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that. So our next question is along the lines of, what does good look like? We often get these types of questions from our audience. So hopefully you can help us out with this one. Is there a specific score a brand would need to reach to feel that they've turned a negative sentiment around? And how long does that usually take?
Yeah. Oh, okay. The perhaps million or maybe $1 billion question. So what does good look like? How do I get there? How do I know that I'm there? So I'm going to give I come from an analyst background. I'm going to give the analyst answer, which is it depends. I know no one ever likes that answer, but it really does depend. And let me talk through what I mean by that. The first is net searcher sentiment, first of all, gives a scale from positive to negative. And so if you're positive, that you're already doing a great job. So that's off to a good start. If you're negative, there's room for improvement. Now there's room for improvement if you're positive as well. That's where I'd start. From there, it's about understanding where you are relative to your competitors, I would say. Are you at the top of the pack? If not, who is? How far is it to bridge that gap? And even if you are at the top of the pack, what is that looking like over time? Are you growing your sentiment over time? What we've seen is that brands that work on it can continue to improve over time. And for every single brand, even number one, even Airbnb, which is at the top of the pack, they could actually improve significantly even from where they are today. So there's always room for improvement. That doesn't mean you're not doing a good job. It just means that until your score is 100% and every single person in the world has a positive view of your brand, there's still more work that you can do. Now, how long does it take to see efforts? It really depends on the nature of what you're going through. Let's think back to Boeing. They've just had a string of bad news. Now, the thing is that bad news isn't accidental. We hear cost-cutting measures that they're taking. We're hearing all these stories about things that they do from a financial perspective that ultimately is having a real challenge on their brand. They're not viewing it from a brand perspective, from a brand safety, from a brand excellence perspective. And that is what seems to be consistently driving that negative story towards their brand. If they were now a big industrial company like Boeing that does products that take years to go through R&D and all of that, that might take longer than other brands in order to right the ship. But you have to start. You have to start doing the work. Now, there's kind of the product perspective, and then there's the PR perspective. So even if Boeing can't change the nature of their engineering and manufacturing and supply chain overnight, they can think about it from a PR angle. And if they can talk about the steps that they're doing, about the work that they're doing, and how they're going to really get past these challenges in a way that is convincing and authentic, and that they clearly mean, that's something that can have an immediate impact today. So but then they need to follow through, because what you're going to see is people will search and understand, have they come through? Have they delivered on what they said they were going to do? Or has it been all kind of fluff? So really, brands can start today to shift short-term sentiment as well as long-term sentiment, and they will see the efforts of that. And the best brands, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones that work at this consistently.
All right. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation. Really appreciate it. Isaac, we're going to take one more question today. Let's take an example of a company like P&G. They have a gigantic brand of portfolios. How does their score apply to individual brands if they're scored at the company level?
Oh, yes. Great question. So the report that we did when we looked at these large multi-brand and multinational companies, what we looked at is we did a composite, ultimately looking at the sentiment towards not just the parent, but the sub-brands. So that gives a snapshot for companies like P&G. Here's how they're doing overall. Now, of course, ultimately, they're going to be managed at that more product level basis of sub-brands, child brands, et cetera. In order to really understand how you're doing and how to improve, you need to do a deep dive into that specific brand, that specific sub-brand, to really understand here's how it fits into the larger picture, and here's the specific takeaways that that brand can have. Now, often these child brands will kind of sit under that umbrella and might get a halo, either positive or negative, from the parent brand, depending on where it is. But even though there's work the parent brand can do, there's even more work, I would argue, that that child brand can do to really stand out and be deemed as excellent.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for that explanation as well. Isaac, it was so good to see you today. Thank you so much for such great content and as well for answering all of those questions. So appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Great being here.
All right. So before we wrap up today, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you a few things going on eMarketer's media channels. You can register for our live analyst and additional Tech Talk webinars on our eMarketer events page at eMarketer.com/events. Also, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, our daily podcast, and also please subscribe to our newsletters. Thank you all for your time. Thanks again to Isaac, the team at Captify, and our eMarketer studio team behind the scenes for making this webinar possible. We'll see you all on the next Tech Talk.